All right, it's the Newport This Week video podcast series. Every week we go inside some of the biggest stories affecting Aquidneck Island and beyond. I'm Bill Bartholomew. Always a great pleasure to spend some time with you. Remember, you can find past episodes on the Newport This Week YouTube channel and newportthisweek.com for not only this, but really everything that is germane to the conversation we're having today. And that conversation is one that has been brewing for some time. And there's a lot of different buckets that we can take a look at when it comes to school regionalization. And really, what happened in plain terms is a step forward that was generated by actions by the Newport City Council. Councilor Xaykham Khamsyvoravong is here to break it all down for us. Good morning, Councilor.
Good morning, Bill. Thanks for having me on.
Executive summary of where we stand right now based on the council's recent action.
We have a long pathway to go if this is something that the voters ultimately decide is the right choice. I want to be clear about three things up front, though. First, there is no offer that is currently pending on the table. We can get into breaking that down a little bit, but that's an important thing to know. It's not like there's an offer that's sitting that's about to expire. There's no actual defined offer sitting on state letterhead waiting for us, but we do have a pathway we could hope for there. Second, there's no clear plan right now as to exactly what that regionalization would look like on day one or what it could look like in the future. But third, and most importantly, what you do have are a collection of us who serve our communities here in both Newport and Middletown who care deeply about the educational futures of our children, who want to work together to figure out if there's a better pathway forward to ensure that our kids get the opportunities they deserve through our public education system.
And what's interesting about this particular conversation is that we've had a lot of different, I don't want to say efforts because that implies that action's been taken, but broadly speaking, there's a lot of conversation in Rhode Island about regionalization. It's not exclusive to school departments. A common thread here is our fire departments, and a lot of people point to Cumberland, where there's like 15. Well, there's not 15, but there's a. And Scott McKay, formerly of the Public's Radio and the Providence Journal, one time said, kind of when we were going over how to assess Rhode Island regionalization, he said, remember, when you look at the Cumberland example, a lot of the reason why you have these departments is because you've got five guys that want to walk around and call each other chief. And it's not necessarily what's best for the community in a fiscal or even just a general practical sense, but there are human beings in play. And the Newport, Middletown, Portsmouth conversations that have happened over the years, it seems like sometimes one or two individuals dictate the fate of the entire community. So where it stands right now, who are the players in this, and where do they stand?
Well, you've got the respective councils on both sides. Newport has spoken, obviously by a majority. The school committee has spoken by a majority. Now we're waiting to hear if our counterparts in Middletown, as a majority, feel the same way. We've obviously all talked individually about this. I want to touch on something you noted earlier, though. Obviously, there's a cynical view that many of us who have been in the business for a while might have relative to why regionalization doesn't work. But I want to give it another spin. If you haven't read Colin Woodard's books, he's a professor at Salve right now. Another spin on this is when you think about the New England's tradition is of civic engagement, and that means serving in your community. And so whether it is serving on a volunteer fire department, serving in elected office, or actually deciding that you're going to commit your career to a level of public service like public school teachers do, that's part of the New England tradition. And that's part of what kind of defines us as who we are. So that's why you have such a high incidence of civic involvement. Second, we don't have county level government that's active here. So many of those intermediate layers that exist in other places that help facilitate regionalization, but also do, yes, add additional expense, we don't have here. And so we have an abnormally high level of locally controlled governing institutions in Rhode Island. But I think that's a reflection of the level of civic engagement. The question you have to ask here is, are we able to let go of our natural kind of parochial instincts that we have as New Englanders to work together and to cede some of that control to allow for better impacts and outcomes for our communities? That's what we're seeing play out here in Newport. A big focus for us on the council has always been on ensuring that students are better off. We mentioned earlier, a lot of the focus is on a hypothetical financial offer from the state that hasn't yet materialized, but we can reasonably assume would be there. I believe that where our focus really needs to be is on how a regional educational system actually improve educational outcomes for students. We spend an enormous amount of money on education. And I will say this, even though it's a large sum, I still don't believe it's enough. But what I do believe is that we are not being smart enough about how we actually engage in educating our students. And we're not focused enough on the types of education our students need to lead healthy and productive lives in the future that afford them the ability to live and thrive in our communities. Our focus from a regional perspective needs to be on how you improve those educational outcomes for students.
I mean, that is literally that paragraph right there. Any state leaders, any players who are listening to this or will be listening to this because they've been sent here because of what you just said, I think that summarizes so much of the conversation around education in Rhode Island as well. And look, there's that cynical view as well of we hear it all the time on talk radio, especially, but it's community wide where, well, school departments are really built for the professionals that work there. And look, that's not true. I mean, that's union bashing usually. But I do think that there is sometimes the adults in the room do need to look around and say, okay, what is best for student outcomes? Let's forget about the metric measuring against Massachusetts, or let's forget about any external metrics and just think about the one by one, what's going to be best for kids, in this case, in Lower Aquidneck Island, what's going to allow them the most diversity of opportunity and the highest quality of opportunity to do exactly what you just said. So to that point, in your mind, how does regionalization better position student outcomes in this
Well,
case specifically with the Aquidneck concept?
exactly. Well, the first step is how could it, right? And that is, are you able to actually ensure that students have a greater level of opportunity, a greater diversity in the course offerings, a higher level of support in ensuring that they're receiving the mental health support that they need and receiving also the educational opportunities that they deserve and need in order to succeed? You can wash away all of the metrics of testing, right? I've been out there saying that I believe that No Child Left Behind, unfortunately, has ended up being a failed federal policy for lack of appropriate resourcing behind it. But one metric that you can pay attention to, that our governor, I have to give credit to for being on top of this consistently, is attendance. It is attendance. And when we're not seeing kids show up at school, it means they're not engaged and they don't understand why it's important. And there may be some truth to that, right? There may be some truth to the reason why they're feeling that way and whether or not education is an area that's going to be effective to helping them get ahead in life. That's where our focus needs to be. I can tell you the reason that my vote shifted from being somebody who was cautiously treading into this, wholly focused on the academic and saying we need to hold back on proceeding forward until we figure out the academic half of this, is the sense of urgency of the situation that we have right now. We have rapidly declining school populations. We have a rapid erosion in federal resources available to us to deal with education. And throughout all of this, we are seeing our kids continue to struggle. And so we need to move quickly. When I saw my colleagues on the Newport School Committee reach such a level of frustration that they put the resolution that would ultimately potentially disband their governing body on a consent calendar, I said, okay, this is a big red flag. They have reached the frustration point where they're throwing their hands up. For your listeners who aren't aware, most public meetings have what's called a consent calendar. This is where you put non-controversial items on that typically don't require any conversation. A good example, somebody wants to play music for a special event for a brief period in the middle of the day. Maybe an entity wants to do a small parade or a small public gathering, non-contentious items. When you think about the fact that the elimination of your governing body is something that you're putting on a consent calendar, what that speaks to is a level of frustration in the public decision makers, those who normally would have a very parochial sense of ownership over an item, saying, we need help and we've got to figure this out. We've got to do something different. My feeling is that, well, yes, we need to capitalize on the need to do something different. We need to do it with a clear plan that focuses on the kids and how we improve their outcomes. They are the future that's going to determine what our community looks like.
Yeah, it's so well said, and it's such a great analysis right there as well, because it's revelatory to exactly where this, you know what it is? It's a crisis. I mean, we have to be honest about it. And it's a crisis, though, that can be, you hear turnaround and you're in Rhode Island, you're starting to think about maybe Central Falls, definitely Providence and the state takeover of schools. And that's like the dramatic turnaround concept. But really what it is planting seeds and knowing where the most fertile places to plant them are, and will be going into the future. And so it'll be interesting to see. I do wonder, and I think last question here is what's your, not necessarily from a practical scheduling standpoint of what comes next, but what ought to come next in this conversation, because that could include things that aren't necessarily the direct workings of government. It could be informing the general public on the pros and cons. It could be an analysis of like what exactly does regionalization offer various levels of students? And by levels, I mean grades, abilities, performances? Or is it literally just like, okay, Middletown has to meet and make a decision here? What's next?
Great question, Bill. And this unfortunately isn't one of those situations where we have an offer sitting on the table in front of us, and I can click into my normal banker attorney mode and say, okay, here are the pros and here are the cons of what's in front of you. There's nothing on the table yet, right? And so the first step has to be figuring out what that offer is that's on the table. That is a two-part equation. The first part, financially, what could this look like? And what do we need from our state legislators to ensure that that financial offer is on the table? But more importantly, and this is what I advocated for in my amendment that I'm thankful my colleagues passed, is we need to actually have an academic plan. And this isn't just hopes and dreams. This is something we've been working on for a period of time. There's an organization called the Academic Integration Advisory Committee. My colleague Ellen Pinnock, working with Steph Smythe and myself, put forth a recommendation that we get the best educational experts we can in the community, and we put that on a commission to look at what a regionalized education system could look like. In part two, which is important, is we're not just asking them to rely on hopes and dreams and their free expertise. We actually included in the budget $250,000 to help support a study. Our hope is that Middletown will meet us at the table with this item, putting appointees on that commission and also matching our funding to ensure that we can have a robust plan to put in front of parents, to put in front of voters, to say, this is the plan. Do you like the plan? Do you trust the plan? And do you think that your family in this community will be better off? But the first step is if we want them to make that assessment, unlike what we've done in the past, we need to put forward a very good plan that focuses on kids and education, especially if we're talking about public schools.
Counselor, thanks so much for your time. We'll keep an eye on this one, obviously. Not much more important when it comes to society than educating the next generation, and there's a lot to learn here, and we'll see where it goes.
Thank you, Bill.